part of the training of every adept, for when cosmic forces are invoked, they always come up in pairs, action and reaction being equal and opposite. But he would never dream of evoking the unbalance, or cliphotic aspect by itself or by its own sake, that being too risky an operation. For practical purposes, when elemental forces are handled, they are dealt with in their sublimated forms. Skemet, the lion-headed fire goddess, for instance, being a preferable form to Kali. These crude forms of force, however, have to be understood by the occultist, or he will have trouble with them. Anybody who makes a serious study of occultism has got to understand these things, and people are not to be branded as black because they study them. In fact, they would be very superficial students if they did not. But anyone who makes a public exhibition or popular exposition of black magic most certainly stands condemned, for it is not necessary that anyone save specialists should be acquainted with these things, and it is better for the general run of mankind to leave them alone, for to dwell upon them tends to put one in touch with them, and unless one takes the precautions that the initiate takes when dealing with them, one is liable to infection. The middle pillar does to people, or the stoicism that is possible in the endurance of pain, or how, if you're lucky, you may die with dignity, to see how corrosive the effects of jealousy can be, or how power corrupts or does not corrupt. For such knowledge and such understanding of the human species, don't look in my textbook of psychology. Try Lear and Othello and Hamlet. As a supplement to William James, read Henry James and Jane Austen and Mark Twain. These people are telling us things that are not on science's program. End quote. Not only is modern clinical psychology detached from the humanities, it is divorced from spirituality. Throughout history, humans have forfeited tranquility, comfort, and sometimes life itself for spiritual motives. Spirituality is important to our health and well-being. It is so much a part of us that trying to understand human beings without it is like trying to study fish and omitting the fact that they live in water. Unfortunately, many psychotherapists have done just that, persuading themselves and their clients to believe that the spiritual portion of them either does not exist or is irrelevant. Psychology and spirituality should not be separate entities. It is time to tear down the artificial walls that define them. The various schools of magic and their extensive teachings comprise an enormous body of wisdom that was the forerunner of modern psychology. The ancient art of magic can give back to the modern science of psychology that which it has so unwisely neglected, a systematic practice for addressing the spiritual factor in humans in a manner that is in accord with modern psychological principles. One of psychology's founding fathers, Carl Gustav Jung, was aware of this even if some of today's psychotherapists have forgotten it. A sign hanging above Jung's office door read, Avocatus atque non avocatus Deus aderet. Whether or not he is called, God will be present. Since the goal of both magic and psychotherapy is the well-being of the individual, it is only natural they become reacquainted with one another. Contemporary psychology must transform itself to include a more holistic approach, wherein the physical, psychological, and transpersonal aspects of the individual are all seen as interconnected, and humanity's need for healing, spirituality, and guidance is respected. If psychology can be compared to a dictionary of words in a specific language, the human psyche, magic can be compared to a book of poetry that makes those words come alive with meaning and relevance in our lives, psychological/spiritual evolution. Now that we have reprimanded modern psychology for its shortcomings, we can explore some of the monumental contributions it has made to the understanding of the human mind. From there, we will explore how psychotherapy and magic can come together to the meaningful enrichment of both, and more importantly, for the benefit and welfare of the individual. Psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is the treatment of mental disorders with methods that revolve around the interpersonal relationship between therapist and client. A large portion of this entails helping clients explore their own ideas about themselves. The earliest form of psychotherapy, called psychoanalysis, began with Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. Freud discovered that the corporeal systems of patients suffering from hysteria often disappeared after seemingly forgotten material was brought into the realm of consciousness. From this, Freud conjectured one of the most fundamental theories of modern psychology, that within the human psyche there exists a powerful segment known as the unconscious, which influences all of our actions, yet functions with material or content that cannot be recalled or remembered by normal processes. He regarded the unconscious as an extensive portion of the mind that housed instinctual drives and the forgotten residue of unwanted life experiences or thoughts. Freud named this forgetting, or the prevention of undesired ideas from entering the conscious mind, repression. Repression is one of a number of defense mechanisms, unconscious reactions employed to satisfy emotional needs, balance opposing objectives, decrease anxiety resulting from unwanted thoughts, or change reality to make it more bearable. The cornerstone of Freud's psychoanalytic therapy was the conscious recollection or recognition of repressed memories and experiences. The basic tools of this therapy were free association and dream interpretation. In recent years, other forms of psychotherapy, including behavior therapy, hypnotherapy, and group therapy, have become popular. In many cases, psychotherapy is not only employed for the treatment of mental disorders, but for less severe problems. Therapists often assist people in breaking unwanted or compulsive habits, smoking, overeating, etc. Freud's triad of the psyche. Freud developed the theory that the conscious mind is only a small part of our mental composition, and our motivations are caused, for the most part, by factors that we are unaware of. Freud postulated that psyche is divided into three distinct factions: the id, the ego, and the superego. According to Freud, the id is the division of the psyche that is completely unconscious and functions as the origin of instinctual impulses and demands for instant satisfaction of primal needs. It is the reservoir of unconscious drives ruled by the pleasure principle and instant gratification. The ego is that portion of the psyche which is conscious, most directly governs thought and behavior, and is most concerned with outer reality. The ego mediates between the id, the superego, and the stipulations of reality or society. The superego, primarily unconscious, is that which is created by the internalization of moral standards from parents and society. It is the conscious and the ego ideal, the moralizing faculty which monitors and censors the ego. Because of society, parental guidance, and peer pressure, humans experience a process of repression from the day of birth. Thus, the id and the superego are usually in conflict in most people, since, as Freud thought, repression was necessary in order for humanity to live within the bounds of civilization. Human beings, according to Freud, are motivated by vital animal instincts, primarily the sexual drive, which he called the libido. Other principal elements of psychology uncovered by Freud were the ideas of the Oedipus complex and infantile sexuality. Freud's tools for exploring the human psyche included the hypnosis, dream analysis, and a new technique that he termed free association. The goal of Freudian analysis was to release repressed memories and provide an increase in self-knowledge that would release trapped energies and result in a more satisfying existence for the patient. Jung and spiritual psychology. The works of Swiss psychologist C.G. Jung, 1875 to 1961, can be seen as part of the apex of the occult revival of the late 19th century. Using the new vocabulary employed by Sigmund Freud, Jung described that knowledge of the human psyche which mystics and magicians had gathered since ancient times. What had once been veiled in occult jargon and symbolism, and thus viewed as superstition and nonsense by the public at large, was now for the first time expressed in such a manner that psychologists and other intellectuals sat up and took notice. Jung's exploration of psychology in conjunction with his study of the paranormal made his theories the crucial link between psychology and magic. However, his interest in occult matters was one of the primary reasons for his ultimate break with Freud. The difference between Freud's and Jung's approaches to psychology was primarily Jung's view that the human psyche was a whole organism, and Freud's belief that it was not. Freud extrapolated a rather disorderly picture of the psyche, wherein autonomous components of the mind battled for dominance. Jung saw the psyche as being complete in itself from birth. The various elements of the psyche attempted to work harmoniously together, and their natural inclination was toward unity. While both men recognized two basic halves of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, Jung further divided the unconscious into two levels, personal and collective. In addition, Freud was more concerned with his patient's past, while Jung emphasized the patient's future development. Whereas Freud referred to his method as psychoanalysis, Jung preferred the phrase analytical psychology. Heilsweg. The psychology which Jung very gradually developed was described by him as Heilsweg, a German word which meant sacred way and a method of healing. Jung's idea of the psyche was based on a separation between the conscious and the unconscious, the personal unconscious being a small tributary of the greater river of the collective unconscious. The pilgrimage of the self symbolized the bringing of unconscious content into the light of consciousness. Heilsweg was a method for differentiating the self from the collective unconscious that was the blueprint of individual existence. It was a way of individuation, or the process by which a person becomes self-realized, a separate indivisible unity or whole which contains all aspects of the self. This was a radical departure from Freud's view that people are enslaved to the drives of the id and superego, which pressure them into conforming with society-sanctioned patterns of behavior. According to Jung, the ego's formation of an identity was not only the beginning of true personhood, but also the commencement of a natural polarity between the general and the specific. Several stages marked the process of Heilsweg, or individuation. The first step was the confrontation with the shadow, those unconscious aspects of the mind which have been buried or ignored by the conscious mind. This begins with the dissolution of the false self, the mask, or the outer persona. Quote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other hand, to conceal the true nature of the individual." End quote. Next, the individual encounters his soul image, the anima, or the animus. The final step is the manifestation in dreams, visions, or fantasies of appropriate archetypes, primordial images such as the wise old man or the great mother, images that appear as themes in religion, mythology, and folklore. The process of individuation contains many particular aspects which collectively might be termed outer psychology. This category includes Jung's separation of introverted and extroverted personality types, as well as his organization of types in accordance with their conjunction of the faculties of sensing, thinking, feeling, and intuition. All of Jung's ideas were of vital importance to modern understanding of the human psyche. However, the most notable contribution of Jungian psychology was the concept that individuation was a spiritual excursion, and it is highly significant that this pioneer of psychology phrased his ideas in spiritual terms. Thus, it is no surprise to find that Jung's system complements the mystical Kabbalah in so many ways. The nature of the psyche. Jung's definition of the psyche included not only that which we call the soul, but also the intellect, the spirit, and the totality of all psychic processes. The psyche is as real as the body is real. All psychic phenomena are real, since the psyche is indistinguishable from its manifestations. The psyche expresses itself in images that are full of meaning and purpose. It creates reality every day. It has its own peculiar structure and form. Quote, "For the psyche as it presents itself, as it is experienced by us, is inseparable from our physical being. But this by no means implies a biological dependency. The psyche deserves to be taken as a phenomenon in its own right. There are no grounds at all for regarding it as a mere epiphenomenon, dependent though it may be on the functioning of the brain. One would be as little justified in regarding life as an epiphenomenon of the chemistry of carbon compounds." End quote. The psyche consists of many parts, but there are two primary divisions that are interrelated: consciousness and unconsciousness. Unconsciousness. The unconscious is not simply the absence of consciousness. It is the division of the mind containing elements of psychic makeup, such as memories or repressed desires, that are not subject to conscious perception or control, but that often affect conscious thoughts and behavior. The personal unconscious is that unknown part of the individual human mind that is older than the conscious part of the mind. It is the primal portion from which consciousness arises. This unconscious, equivalent to Freud's superego, is unique to the individual, and it contains suppressed, forgotten, or subliminally perceived contents originating from a person's life. Whereas the mind can be trained, the unconscious cannot. It is a creative and autonomous psychic entity that is beyond subjective control. Jung concluded that the collective unconscious does not include personal characteristics distinctive to one's individual ego, but rather the sum of what is inherited from the biological and psychic structure common to the human race. They are those acts and mental patterns that are universally shared by all humanity. The primordial images of the collective unconscious are the result of thousands of years of human struggle and experience. Quote, "Every great experience in life, every profound conflict, evokes the accumulative treasure of these images and brings about their inner constellation, but they become accessible to consciousness only when the individual possesses so much self-awareness and power of understanding that he also reflects on what he experiences instead of just living it blindly. In the later event, he actually lives the myth and the symbol without knowing it." End quote. Consciousness. Consciousness is that component of waking awareness perceptible to a person at any given instant. It is a state of being mentally awake and observant, of having an awareness of one's environment and one's own existence, sensations, and thoughts. Consciousness is therefore the function which sustains the relationship between psychic content and the ego. Many mistake consciousness with mere thinking, when consciousness actually includes feeling, will, fantasy, and all other facets of waking life. Sentience is one of humanity's defining attributes, as stated by Jung. Quote, "Man's capacity for consciousness alone makes him man." End quote. Elsewhere, Jung states, quote, "And yet the attainment of consciousness was the most precious fruit of the tree of knowledge, the magical weapon which gave man victory over the earth, and which we hope will give him a still greater victory over himself." End quote. Jung believed that the most important objective for any individual was the attainment of harmony between the two halves of the psyche, the conscious and the unconscious. In this manner, man would achieve the, quote, "greater victory over himself." End quote. The shadow. Quote, "If the repressed tendencies, the shadow as I call them, were obviously evil, there would be no problem whatsoever. But the shadow is merely somewhat inferior, primitive, unadapted, and awkward, not wholly bad. It even contains childish or primitive qualities which would, in a way, vitalize and embellish human existence." End quote. The shadow represents the sum of all personal and collective psychic elements which, due to their incompatibility with the selected conscious demeanor, are refused expression in life and consequently unite into a somewhat independent splinter personality, a type of alter ego, whose unconscious inclinations run opposite those of the conscious. It is our dark brother, who is a hidden but undeniable part of our total psyche. The development of the shadow coincides with that of the ego. Aspects that the ego rejects are repressed and have little or no outlet in a person's conscious life. The shadow often behaves to counterbalance the conscious, which can be positive or negative. Very much an archetypal figure, the shadow personality often appears symbolically in dreams as being the same sex as the dreamer. In addition, an individual will sometimes project his shadow, i.e. his own unwanted subconscious characteristics, onto another person. In keeping with his views on the unconscious, Jung proposed that there are actually two forms of the shadow: the personal shadow, composed of the individual's cast-off psychic content, and the collective shadow, which embodies all the collective repressed memories of humankind. By the way, on page 112, there is a figure 5, Jung's model of the psyche, outer world, inside a self, surrounded by ego and the shadow, The shadow contains animus, anima. The ego contains the persona. On the outside of the circle is collective unconscious and collective conscious. The personal goes in the collective conscious into self, and the unconscious in the collective unconscious also goes towards self in the middle. All right, back to the reading. Confronting the shadow. Quote, everyone carries a shadow, and unless it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. Furthermore, it is constantly in contact with other interests, so that it is continually subjected to modifications. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected. End quote. Throughout our lives, we are constantly having to suppress one attribute or another. Thus, the shadow can never completely be assimilated into consciousness. However, it is essential that the most conspicuous aspects of the shadow be raised to consciousness. Instead of rejecting the shadow, its counterpart, the ego will be invigorated by it. If the shadow is not reckoned with, it runs the risk of becoming a vast, dark, forgotten expanse, which blocks one's inner creativity from being fully available to the conscious mind. This is why some people strive with Herculean strain to keep a tight lid on their shadows, concealing their private demons with a thin veneer of moral perfection. The spiritual fortress they construct around themselves is nothing more than a synthetic buttress held in place by force, and ever in danger of structural failure should the wind change direction. Mere suppression of the shadow is as little a remedy as beheading would be for a headache. It is for this reason that confronting the shadow is the first step in Jung's method of individuation. To do this means taking a starkly critical and objective look into the nature of one's own being. Unconscious content is usually experienced in projection upon something that is outside of us. In the case of unwanted psychic content, some people will readily project their shadow onto someone else. Thus, we have a tendency to shift the blame onto an appropriate scapegoat. The other guy did it. As a comedian once insisted, the devil made me do it. It is extremely difficult for some analysts, to accept the fact that they do indeed have a deep, dark side. The therapist, who tries to bring the shadow out into the open, often meets with enormous resistance because the client fears that the artificial structure he has carefully constructed to protect his ego will come crashing down. This is, in fact, the point at which many analyses fail, and the client, incapable of facing his unconscious self, stops the process cold and withdraws into his comfortable old self-deceptions. All of us must face our shadow side. This is especially important for magicians who seek to delve into the inner recesses of the human psyche, the mind of the microcosm. No spiritual progress can be made without it. We must discover the distinct characteristics of our shadow, as opposed to other parts of the psyche, such as the ego, and recognize it for what it is, a natural part of ourselves and nothing to be ashamed of or feel guilty about. Guilt and shame often cause one to repress the shadow in the first place, allowing a small, undesirable trait to grow into a huge, unresolved conflict, compulsion, or neurosis. In some ways, the shadow is like a neglected and resentful child who, if shown kindness and understanding, can learn to play with the other children. Objective understanding of ourselves will make it easier to face the shadow and other parts of the psyche as well. Regression exercise. Examining the events of one's childhood is a prerequisite for determining how the shadow developed. An excellent method for recalling childhood memories is the following regression exercise. Perform the LBRP. Perform the fourfold breath. Breathe in the count of 4. Hold the breath to the count of 4. Exhale to the count of 4. Keep the lungs empty to the count of 4. Sit in a comfortable position or lie down, eyes closed. Spend a few minutes inducing relaxation and rhythmic breathing. Visualize yourself within your present surroundings. As you continue the fourfold breath, see yourself going backwards in time. As you inhale to the count of 4, think of last spring. Hold the breath for 4 counts and think of last winter. Exhale to the count of 4 and imagine last fall. On the empty, hold to the count of 4, think of last summer. Continue the exercise in this fashion, going backwards in time, from spring to winter, fall, and summer, ever backwards, keeping pace with the fourfold breath. You may decide to go back in time in 5-year intervals, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, etc. At any one of these intervals, stop and visualize yourself at that particular point in time. Observe how you looked, how your surroundings looked, the people around you at that time, how you felt about yourself, and how you saw your world. Examine significant events that occurred which shaped your view of the world and of yourself. When ready to end the exercise, use the fourfold breath to visualize time moving forward again. Inhale, spring, full hold, summer. Exhale, fall, empty hold, winter. Move time forward again until you arrive at the present. End the exercise with the LBRP. Always record your observations. You should practice this exercise several times, deciding beforehand what time in the past you wish to examine further. If you become quite proficient in this technique, you can go back 1 year at a time, all the way to birth. Trauma release exercise. Sometimes traumatic experiences or memories are responsible for creating parts of the shadow personality. In such cases, a trauma release exercise can help the analysand, let go of the calamitous experience and begin to heal. The technique for this is as follows. Have the person lie on their back. Place your right hand on their forehead and your left hand at the back of their head. A breathing technique to further relaxation is helpful at this point. Next, guide the person to slowly visualize the traumatic event in the reverse order it happened, to a time before it occurred. In other words, emphasize that the details of the event will look like a videotape running in reverse and in slow motion. Then have the person run this mental tape in its natural order, forward in time, until arriving at the initial point when the event began. Guide the person to repeat this backward and forward motion until they no longer feel an emotional connection to the event. At the close of the session, have the person take a long, deep breath as they reflect upon any stress or concerns. Hold the breath for a few seconds and then release it, letting go of any residual tensions. Repeat this process 3 times. It is usually recommended that the person do this exercise a number of times on their own over a period of a few weeks to be certain that it is effective. It can also be done entirely solo, if preferred. Anima and animus. The second step in the process of individuation is defined by the encounter with the animus or the anima. The anima is the embodiment of the reflective feminine nature of man's subconscious, while the animus is the personification of the creative masculine nature of a woman's subconscious. Both are soul images, which usually manifest themselves in anthropomorphic form as fantasy lovers in dream and imagination. Animus and anima have a direct relationship with the persona or mask. If the persona is emotional, the soul image is rational, and vice versa. They are two of the most important archetypes, often influencing how we respond to members of the opposite sex. People often search out and are attracted to someone who symbolizes the attributes of their own psyche. Quote, every man carries within him the eternal image of women, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definitive feminine image. This image is fundamentally unconscious, an hereditary factor of primordial origin engraved in the living organic system of the man, an imprint or archetype of all the ancestral experiences of the female, a deposit, as it were, of all the impressions ever made by women. Since this image is unconscious, it is always unconsciously projected upon the person of the beloved, and it is one of the chief reasons for passionate attraction or aversion. End quote. We must learn to discriminate between interior and exterior manifestation of the anima and animus, just as we must distinguish ourselves from our shadow. Whereas the conscious recognition of the shadow brings forth the knowledge of one's own dark side, as it relates to a person's own sex, so does the recognition of the animus or anima provide the means for understanding the contrasexual portion of the psyche. It is precisely this lack of discrimination that leads a person to repeatedly seek out a certain kind of mate, a bad boy or a nasty girl, type who will inevitably treat them poorly. This is exactly how some individuals, in failing to differentiate between their own soul image and secret inner desires and a prospective mate, project the inner image outward and consequently fall into bad relationships time and time again. Sometimes the animus and anima can be symbolized by parental figures, leading some people to try to find a companion who resembles their father or mother in some way. While attempting to find the perfect mate, externalization of the soul image leads some to look outside of themselves for the perfection and beauty that lies within. This is true for most people who choose a mate who represents the subconscious portion of the psyche. And since no human mate can fit perfectly into the transferred image, after time, the carrier of the projection displays his or her own character traits, resulting in frustration and discord in the relationship. If a person could only recognize the soul image within as a part of their own inner self, they would stop attributing their flaws to their mate and retract the projection. Any psychic energy that has been bound up in the projection would be freed for other, more progressive pursuits. The encounter with the soul image usually takes place later in life, after the dynamics of youth, reproduction, and the priorities of the outer world have been satiated. Confronting the soul image is an indication that the second half of one's life has commenced. Once the contrasexual soul image has been brought to consciousness, however, it may not be possible to, quote, lose ourselves completely, end quote, in the love of another, for we have now found the object of that love within us. This brings with it the realization that we are, in fact, complete within ourselves, and we do not need a slavish love to a projected illusion in order to prop us up. Instead, we are enabled to develop a deeper love and a conscious devotion to our partner. The proper role of the soul image is that of the psychopomp, guiding the soul around impasses on its own way towards spiritual transformation. It is the mediator between the conscious and the unconscious. Whereas the persona is the reconciler between the ego and the outer world, the soul image is the reconciler between the ego and the inner world. Once fully realized and integrated, the soul image can bring incredible enrichment into consciousness and a vital expansion of the true self. Archetypes. The third step in the process of individuation is the manifestation of archetypes. An archetype is an idea, mode of thought, or God form that has manifested from the inherited experiences of humankind from the collective unconscious. Quote, the concept of the archetype is derived from the repeated observation that, for instance, the myths and fairy tales of world literature contain definite motifs which crop up everywhere. We meet these same motifs in the fantasies, dreams, deliria, and delusions of individuals living today. These typical images and associations are what I call archetypal ideas. The more vivid they are, the more they will be colored by particularly strong feeling tones. They impress, influence, and fascinate us. They have their origin in the archetype, which in itself is an irrepresentable, unconscious, pre-existent form that seems to be part of the inherited structure of the psyche and can therefore manifest itself spontaneously anywhere at any time. End quote. According to Jung, once the soul image has been integrated, next comes the manifestation of the major archetypes of spirit and matter. These include the wise old man as the spirit principle in man, and the great mother as the principle of matter or nature in women. Here we are dealing with the primal roots of the psyche of either sex back to its origins, and the ancient god forms from which they derive. Both the wise old man and the great mother can appear in a multitude of figures from all world mythologies. They are the sky gods, earth mothers, heroes, heroines, magicians, priests, priestesses, prophetesses, harvest gods, and fertility goddesses of all pantheons. These ancient archetypes are transcendent energies that can bring much wisdom and spiritual growth. Jung referred to archetypal figures of the psyche as mana personalities. This is a particular archetype or group of archetypes that the individual psyche most strongly expresses or manifests. A person who has mana is said to have power and influence over others, but also runs the risk of becoming self-centered and megalomaniacal. This is because these great universal archetypes produce a potent attraction which can, in some instances, entice the individual into identifying him or herself with the archetype, creating a type of self-aggrandizement or ego inflation. Such is the path of many modern-day messiahs, self-appointed gurus, and power-mad spiritual leaders. Quote, an inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. It is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of understanding contemporary events, and incapable of drawing right conclusions about future. It is hypnotized by itself and therefore cannot be argued with. It inevitably dooms itself to calamities that must strike it dead. End quote. All of us surrender to such arrogance during this process of individuation. However, the creative energies that are stimulated in the psyche by the appearance of archetypes can be fully accessed only after one has humbly acquired the ability to discern the difference between him or herself and them. On the road to self-growth, we must not mistake personal insights into our own inner workings as messages from God to his new chosen prophet. We must work to clarify our relationship to spirit and nature as represented by the gods' archetypes. These potent and eternal forces are a part of our psyche that are meant to empower and inspire us. Magicians regard archetypes as various forms or images of divinity that teach us about ourselves and our place in the divine universe. The conscious recognition of the psychic elements that comprise the mana personality archetype brings the first real sense of authentic individuality. Accessing archetypes. Although textbooks on psychology provide few examples of archetypes for the reader to explore, various textbooks on magic are often replete with such prototype figures. Many are readily found in the cards of the tarot. Meditation on these images, as well as a host of tarot exercises that can be found in such books as Madonna Compton's Archetypes on the Tree of Life, Gareth Knight's Tarot and Magic, Paul Foster Case's Book of Tokens, or our own book, The New Golden Dawn Ritual Tarot, can be used to identify and connect with the various archetypes that inhabit the psyche. Several archetypes in the form of gods and goddesses are correlated to the spheres on the Tree of Life, according to their nature and characteristics. War and fire gods are assigned to Gebura, goddesses of love and pleasure to Netzach, etc. A small selection of deities from several pantheons are listed in Chapter 10. Meditation on these figures can aid in understanding the archetypal beings that one may encounter in the process toward true self-awareness. It is important that the student not fall into the trap of the psychologization of magic that is a result of misunderstanding Jung's theories. To the pop psycholo-occultist, the archetypes, deities, and symbols are simply creations of the human mind. They have no existence beyond the individual human being. Pop psychology sometimes gives the impression that humans create, work with, and discard archetypes as easily as an old pair of shoes, in a kind of superficial mental role-playing game. This view does not do Jung's theory justice, since archetypes exist eternally and independently of any individual. To truly understand this, one must be willing to accept the spiritual, magical side of human existence. We are part of a cosmic ecosystem, so to speak. Self-realization. Throughout the process of individualization, unconscious content has been gradually raised into consciousness. Combined with the dissolution of the persona and the decrease in the sovereign power of the conscious mind, this new awareness brings with it a state of psychic imbalance. Magicians refer to this time as, quote, the dark night of the soul, end quote. This intentionally creates imbalanced works to remove any mental impediments which stand in the way of further psychic growth. If the conscious mind is able to absorb and develop the psychic content emerging from the subconscious, then this state of balance induces the independent, intuitive activity of the unconscious to create a new equilibrium, and the result, as Jung put it, is, quote, the victory over the collective psyche, end quote. Then and only then is the median between the conscious and the unconscious to be found. This is the archetypal image of the self, and self-realization is the final step on the path of individuation. The emergence of the self is a transformation of the psyche, which involves a whole new outlook toward life. This is no easy process. Primal impulses from the subconscious will still assail us, but no longer will we totally identify ourselves with them or flee from them. We must do our best.
The demographic won't be able to afford it if we push the rate up 1%, or if we push the inflation rate up.
Well, you know what I asked it, actually? Here's what I asked it. I said, of all politicians, like, which can you think of as, like, what was the first question? Has the highest according to you? And this is what it's saying. Paul Manafort, Trump's 2016 campaign chair. Michael Flynn, Trump ex-national security.
And you can go in there.
So would you like me to unfollow you so that I can't do that?
Hello?
Well, do you want me to keep where you're at and go there, or do you want me to just remove it?
No, I just
Hello?
this because it was weird.
Well, I want you to be comfortable, so if you'd like me to remove you as a friend, I will do that.
Oh, really? After everything you said, you want me to be comfortable. That's so nice.
Sure.
Wow.
Of course I want you to be comfortable.
Hello?
Who's now subscribed?
Should I keep following
We
you?
can hear you.
Nigga, should I keep following you or not?
Oh, did he just use the N-word?
To understand them, and we should not let the resulting tension between the waking consciousness and the unconscious process disturb our daily routine in any way. Our ability to withstand this tension and persevere through a state of psychic imbalance is what will lead us to a new psychic equipoise. Consciousness and unconsciousness complement each other to form the greater principle of the self. Not only is the self at the center of these two halves of the psyche, it is also the circumference which surrounds them. According to Jung, the only content of the self that we can know is the individuated ego. Endeavoring to know more, we run into the boundaries of our own knowledge. The self is transcendental. It can only be felt and experienced, never wholly understood by the rational mind. Quote, it, as strange to us and yet so near, wholly ourselves and yet unknowable, a virtual center of mysterious constitution. The beginnings of our whole psychic life seem to be inextricably rooted in this point, and all our highest and ultimate purposes seem to be striving toward it. This paradox is unavoidable, as always when we try to define something that lies beyond the bourne of our understanding. End quote. It is obvious that Jung is bordering on the mystical here. Jungian psychology differs from other systems in that it presents ethical objectives that have much in common with magical goals. The discovery of the self might well be described as the completion of the great work, or the creation of the philosopher's stone. The expansion of consciousness through the elevation of heretofore unconscious material is a form of spiritual illumination. This does not mean that the individual who experiences illumination or self-realization will spend the rest of his days in blissful meditation, but rather that he will gradually gain a more true understanding of himself and his connection to the divine. The goal of Jungian psychology is the creation of psychic wholeness. It is not by any stretch of the imagination limited to the treatment of mental illness. Treatment today is often sought out to cure a feeling of pointlessness or to find new purpose and direction in life. As we approach the 21st century, humanity is besieged by collective neurosis and spiritual erosion. But the cure will not be found in adherence to rigid church dogmas or cold, detached methods of psychology. Countering the disorientation of modern humanity will require a combination of spiritual awareness, mystical experience, fundamental ethics, and sound psychotherapies. A method for self-realization which encompasses magic and psychology, such as the middle pillar exercise, is part of the answer. The symbol of unity. The psyche that has received the benefits of self-realization is expressed in a glyph called the uniting symbol. This is a symbol which portrays the union of all parts of the psyche, yet its synthesis transcends all of its separate components. It represents the restored equilibrium between the conscious and the unconscious. The uniting symbol portrays a balanced psychological state that we wish to achieve. In Eastern societies, the uniting symbol often takes the form of a drawing called a mandala, or magic circle, said to be a balancing glyph of the cosmos. The most important uniting symbol in the West is the Kabbalistic tree of life. Reich and his theories. Wilhelm Reich, 1897 to 1957, studied medicine and Freudian analysis at Vienna University. He spent 2 years doing postgraduate work under Professor Wagner Warheg. It was during this time that he formulated two of his most recognized theories. The first was the concept of physiological armory, muscular tension or physical rigidity that had the same effect as a neurosis, That is, it serves as a mechanism for the repression of unwanted psychic content. The second is the idea that schizophrenia is a bottling up of energy within the autonomic nervous system. Reich believed that psychic problems caused muscular tension, and any successful therapy had to treat both sides of the disturbance, mind and body. His remedy was to develop a psychoanalytical treatment combined with deep, often painful, massage, which would break down the physical armament, and in turn liberate the psyche from neurosis. This represented an assault on the psychic problem by using physical manipulation. He called his method of treatment vegetotherapy, or as it is sometimes known as nonverbal psychotherapy. The goal of this treatment was not simply to relax the muscles, but to bypass all verbal or intellectual defense mechanisms, to reconnect the exterior ego with the interior reality, and release the material which was being repressed. In 1936, Reich began a series of experiments that resulted in his theory of orgone energy. This was a type of life force energy that Reich thought was vital to good health and which permeated all life. Some have compared it to the astral light of ceremonial magicians. Reich thought that muscular tension blocked the free flow of orgone energy in human beings, and that his vegetotherapy liberated the flow of orgone. His research got him into trouble, both in Nazi Germany and later in the US, where he built a machine that was said to extract orgone from the atmosphere and project it into the human body. Nevertheless, the theories of Reich and thought are thought by many people to be an important conjunction between psychotherapy and magic. Transpersonal psychology. Coinciding with an interest in magic, today there is also increased attention being paid to transpersonal or depth psychology, a trend initiated by Jung and further examined by psychologists such as Roberto Assagioli, 1888 to 1975. The word transpersonal means that which transcends the personal or the individual. Transpersonal psychology takes a more spiritual approach to the human dilemma and does not reject the idea of the soul, rather it embraces it. A true system of transpersonal psychology must examine the highest aspects of the unconscious and take a philosophical as well as pragmatic approach to human evolution. Seeing that psychoanalysis was an incomplete system, Assagioli developed his own form of therapy and called it psychosynthesis. Psychosynthesis accepts the idea of the soul, the libido, and the imagination as essential aspects of the human being. It also includes the use of symbolism and allegory to initiate alchemical change and psychic integration. Quote, may I emphasize the fact that the elements and functions coming from the superconscious, such as aesthetic, ethical, religious experiences, intuition, inspiration, states of mystical consciousness, are factual, are real in the pragmatic sense, because they are effective, producing changes both in the inner and the outer world. Therefore, they are amenable to observation and experimentation through the use of the scientific method in ways suited to their nature. Also, they can be influenced and utilized through psycho-spiritual techniques, end quote. Assagioli defined the parts of the psyche as 1. The collective unconscious, a surrounding psychic membrane which permits constant and active interchange between all parts of the psyche and with the general psychic environment. It is the common primordial symbols, images, and metaphors of all humanity, the part of the soul that is shared. Archetypes of the collective unconscious include extremely primordial god images, such as the Mesopotamian Apsu and the Greek Chaos. 2. The higher self, or the true transpersonal self, which is above and is unaffected by the thoughts from the mind stream or the sensations of the body. It is that pure consciousness, the core of the self, that underlies all other aspects and functions of the psyche as well. All personal energy and consciousness issues from this source. Archetypes of the higher self include omnipotent sky gods, such as the Babylonian Marduk, the Greek Zeus, and the Hebrew Yahweh. 3. The conscious self, or I, is the ego or point of self-awareness. It is the seat of personal identity that we organize our field of awareness around. Its function is to coordinate the vast amount of interior and exterior information that we acquire and to act as a intermediary between our internal and external realities. Experience is processed by the ego through various functions such as the emotions, the senses, the intellect, and the imagination. To carry out these duties, the ego relies on discrimination, reason, and certain defense mechanisms that often conflict with other aspects of the psyche, sometimes posing obstacles to growth and healing. Archetypes of the ego include all deities who have walked between the worlds of life and death, conscious and subconscious, such as the Sumerian Inanna and the Egyptian Osiris. 4. The field of consciousness, which contains the ego, is the incessant flow of observable images, feelings, and thoughts, sensations, and impulses. Archetypes of this region include several groups of deities with a variety of attributions: wisdom, Enki, Thoth, Hermes, love, Hathor, Aphrodite, war, Horus, Ares, pleasure, Bes, Pan, etc. 5. The higher unconscious or superconscious is the transpersonal level of the unconscious, containing higher intuitions, inspirations, latent psychic functions, and spiritual energies. It is here that the higher self expresses itself in various forms through archetypes. The ordinary person is usually unaware of these forces and archetypes, until they are brought to light during the process of self-realization. Archetypes of the superconscious include the first gods of a pantheon, such as the Greek Titans or the Norse giants. 6. The middle unconscious is an inner region similar and accessible to that of the waking consciousness. This contains all things in our field of awareness that we are not normally aware of, but that we can become aware of. It is an unconscious matrix that underlies the conscious mind, where the mental activities are incubated before their birth into consciousness. Archetypes of the middle unconscious include all deities who are associated with prophecy and oracles, such as the Greek divinities Apollo and Gaia. Narrator's note, there is a figure 6, Asagioli's model of the psyche. It contains a picture of the higher self, the collective unconscious, in an oval, and then a circle in the middle of that oval. And the circle in the middle is the field of consciousness, and a point in the center is the conscious self. And there's higher consciousness, higher unconscious, middle unconscious, and lower unconscious within the oval. 7. The lower unconscious contains fundamental drives, primitive urges, inferior dreams, and complexes. This is the personal unconscious, which is the storehouse of hidden memories, repressed psychic content, and the shadow personality. This part of the psyche is accessed by working with hypnosis, trance, and imagery. Archetypes of the lower unconscious include all underworld deities, such as the Sumerian goddess Erish, Kigal, and the Greek divinities Hades and Persephone. If we were to add anything to Asagioli's model, it would be the body or manifest psyche, which must be considered in a holistic psychology. Mind and body are interrelated extensions of one another. Just as physical discomfort can affect the mind, through focused visualization, can affect the body. Archetypes of the manifest psyche include all earth deities, such as the Egyptian Geb, the Babylonian Nin-Hursag, and the Greek Demeter. Asagioli's division of the psyche is remarkably similar to the Kabbalistic model of the soul. Like Jung, he saw the pressing need for all human beings to achieve a balanced inner integration and true self-realization, and he outlined a system for achieving this goal in 4 stages. 1. Through knowledge of one's personality. This includes a frank analysis of all parts of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, including the shadow. Psychoanalysis is the method used by the therapist for this objective. In magic and alchemy, it is the first half of the equation, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. 2. Control of the personality's various elements. After having discovered all parts of the psyche, we must take control of them. According to Asagioli, one of the most effective ways of achieving this is a method called disidentification, which aids in the dissolution of harmful complexes whose newly freed energies can be controlled and used toward more positive ends. Dispelling these complexes requires the methods of objectification, critical analysis, and discrimination. In magic, the shadow aspects of the psyche are collectively called the evil persona. They must be recognized, subjugated to the magician's higher spiritual will, and their energies transmuted and employed for the completion of the great work. 3. Realization of one's true self, the discovery of creation of a unifying center. The intermediate link, which, if focused on and identified with, allows for the integration/unification of the lower and higher selves, and freedom from selfish interests and personal limitations, a point of connection between the individual and the divine self, which is reflected and symbolized in that point. 4. Psychosynthesis, the formation or reconstruction of the personality around the new center. Once the unifying center is found, the next step is to gradually and systematically build a new ideal personality around it in an organized, purposeful manner and with clear, achievable goals in mind. Practical psychosynthesis commences with the construction of this new personality. This process involves the active utilization of all available energies and the transmutation of unconscious and previously latent forces, development of those aspects of the personality which are weak or insufficient. It is accomplished through techniques of autosuggestion, affirmation, visualization, and by the systematic training of the less developed functions of imagination, will, and memory. Finally, all the various psychological energies and functions must be coordinated as the new personality achieves a stable, organized form. There are many levels in the process of transmutation and self-realization, and as stated earlier, they are not always entirely pleasant. It is a multifaceted process which includes several stages: the elimination of impediments which block the flow of energies between the superconscious and the lower realms of consciousness, evolvement of latent or dormant higher functions, memory, will, imagination, etc., and stages where the ego must yield to the work of the higher self and withstand the stresses and unavoidable discomfiture that the process requires. In magic, this is the spiritual discipline of the great work and reunification, the second half of the solve et coagula formula of alchemy. It represents our goal to become more than human, or in less mystical terms, to become the best possible human being we can be, evolving to our fullest potential. Various methods and tools are employed in psychosynthesis, just as they are in other transpersonal psychologies. In psychosynthesis, the focus is always on a holistic approach to treatment, and all techniques used are subservient to the health, well-being, and psychic integration of the individual. The keeping of a diary, dream analysis, free association, hypnosis, group analysis, psychodrama, relaxation, meditation, music therapy, autosuggestion, humor therapy, chromotherapy, disidentification, visualization, development of the will, utilization of the symbols and metaphors, transmutation and sublimation of sexual energies, and development of the imagination are but a few of the methods used to obtain self-realization. One of the goals of psychosynthesis is to integrate the superconscious as much as possible into the conscious and unconscious realms. Numerous metaphors for this process of self-realization and self-integration can be found in the language of the alchemists. What spiritual alchemy describes as the transformation of lead into gold is simply another way of describing the transmutation of the mundane into the spiritual, discord into harmony, and the personal into the transcendent. Imagination and the transconscious self. With the lines between psychology and magic becoming increasingly transparent, we arrive at a new, more transcendent interpretation of consciousness. The connecting link between all parts of the self is the transconscious self, composed for the most part, of the processes of imagination, intuition, and will. The transconscious is a reconciling intelligence with a unique nature. It has the ability to move through, communicate with, and cause change on all levels of the psyche, and is capable of a wide range of powers associated with communication and transformation. The imagination is the essential aspect of the transconscious self. It is a potent medium for the processes of inspiration, transmutation, integration, and transcendence. The transconscious imagination operates as a single organized mechanism, purposefully flowing between all portions of the psyche with a unifying objective. Its vast creative resources are a primary influence in the development of music, dance, literature, and other art forms. The transconscious imagination expresses itself in two ways: the intuitive imagination and the creative imagination, which relate respectively to the natures of the reflective anima and the creative animus. Together, these two archetypes coalesce into the partly androgynous archetype of Hermes, the messenger god, who symbolizes the transconscious imagination as the psychopomp, the guide, healer, and protector of the soul. The language of the soul and the imagination is revealed in symbol, image, and allegory. Therefore, in all mythologies, the many figures, places, and situations are metaphors for different archetypes, as well as different aspects of the psyche and transformative experiences. Thus does Hermes, representing the soul guide and the transconscious self, communicate to all levels of the psyche through symbol and myth. The imagination is one of the most important tools of magic. A focused imagination is employed by magicians for everything from the consecration of talismans to healing. Concentration on a visualized image or symbol is the key to this type of working. In healing, the source of the infection or injury is often visualized as being dissolved, or the sick individual is imaged as being free from the diseased. The exploration of the unconscious realms usually begins with the image of descending into a basement, a cave, or the underworld. Superconscious levels are often contacted by visualizing the climbing of a steep hill or climbing the branches of a mystical tree. Properly used, the imaginative faculties of the transconscious self can be used to activate the latent faculties of the psyche and bring renewed health and well-being to the entire mind/body system. The Tree of Life. The Kabbalah is the mystical system of the medieval Jews. Its exact origins are buried in antiquity. Its primary symbol, the Tree of Life, is said to be a glyph of the essence of God, the origins of the cosmos, the soul of man, and a model of how to live in accordance with the divine plan. It is also the most important symbol used by magicians and other practitioners of the Western esoteric tradition. For our purposes, we will focus upon the Tree of Life as a uniting symbol, an image of the individuated psyche. The tree itself is composed of 10 Sephiroth, spheres or emanations, which are listed in order and are pictured in Figure 2 of Chapter 2. Kether, the crown; Chokmah, wisdom; Bina, understanding; Chesed, mercy; Gabura, strength; Tifareth, beauty; Netzach, victory; Hod, splendor; Yesod, foundation; and Malkuth, the kingdom. The parts of the soul. To the Kabbalists, the human soul is divided into 3 principal portions, which overlap in some instances. These are the Neshama, the Ruach, and the Nefesh. The highest of these, the Neshama, encompasses the Sephiroth of Kether, Chokmah, and Bina. It corresponds to the highest aspirations of the soul, and what Asad Gioli described as the higher unconscious or superconscious. The greater Neshama is further subdivided into 3 parts: the Yechida, the Chia, and the Neshama. The Yechida, centered in Kether, is our true divine self, comparable to Asad Gioli's higher self, the root essence of our spiritual nature. It is that part of us that is nearest to God, the most perfect level of the self. The Yechida is the supreme, undifferentiated quality of mind that is pure, unexpanded consciousness. It simply is, I am that I am. The Chia, or life force, located in Chokmah, is the highest active principle in the human soul. It is our divine will, our inquisitive urge to become more than human, symbolized by the masculine soul image of the animus, or the figure of the supernal father. The Chia is the source of our powers of action. The subdivision of the Neshama, as distinct from the greater Neshama, is the intuitive soul located in Bina, although it lends its name to the other supernals as being generally descriptive of the soul's greatest aspirations. It is also the most approachable of the 3 supernal parts of the soul. The Neshama in Bina is symbolized by the feminine soul image of the anima, as well as the Shekinah, the supernal mother, or the Gnostic Sophia. It is the source of human perception, comprehension, and spiritual understanding. Narrator's note, there is a figure 7. At the top is a circle Neshama, with Neshama, Yechida, and Chia. There's the Kabbalist tree of life, and there's 3 circles. I'll link all these in the description below. All right, let's move on. The Neshama in Bina initiates delineating ways in which the self can be defined as being unique to the individual, as well as limitless in archetypal manifestation. It is the understanding of how the divine manifests itself through a multitude of archetypal forms, and how it expresses itself more fully as the process of self-realization continues to unfold. The neshama carries within it the instinct and blueprint for self-realization. The neshama, as a whole, is our true desire, or deepest state of consciousness, the intuitive power that connects humankind with the divine. It is our superconscious, intuitive mind. According to the ancient Kabbalists, this part of the soul remains dormant until the individual is spiritually awakened to its existence. The neshama, divine self, higher soul, or higher genius, embraces the elevated aspects of the collective unconscious. It is the divine spark that is common to all of humanity. Between the neshama and the middle part of the soul is a great boundary known as the abyss. This is the line of intersection between mortal and eternal, personal and transpersonal, separateness and unity. That which is above the abyss is immortal and common to us all. That which is below the abyss is temporary and individual. The shadowy sephira, or rather non-sephira, of Da is located within the abyss. Its function is to create a bridge between the higher and middle parts of the soul, neshama and ruach, so that the neshama can descend and the conscious mind thereby connect with, and perhaps gain some understanding of, the nature of spirit and divinity. The middle soul, or rational self, the ruach, is located in the 5 sephiroth, from Chesed to Yesod, although it is centered in Tiferet. It also overlaps to a lesser extent Dath and Yesod. This is the conscious mind and reasoning powers, the conscious part of our being, which is the abode of the ego. This is the seat of outer consciousness, where humanity becomes aware of thought images and is able to fashion thoughts into actions. It is here that human beings use their powers of discrimination as the mind navigates continuously between both secular and transcendent functions. 5 faculties are to be found in this pentad of spheres: memory, chesed, will, gebura, imagination, tiferet, emotion, netzach, and intellect, hod. The 2 lowest of these functions, corresponding to the spheres of netzach and had, are quite easy for the average person to understand. The 3 higher faculties of the ruach, attributed to the 4th through the 6th sephiroth, are somewhat more difficult to access. This is because of the demarcation called the veil of Peroketh that exists on the tree between Tifereth and the 2 lower spheres of netzach and had. Thus, the higher ruach faculties of memory, will, and imagination are obstructed somewhat and are often less accessible to the individual than are the lower functions of thinking and feeling. The ruach contains both the middle unconscious and the field of consciousness of Asagioli's system, as well as his concept of the conscious self or ego. The higher self or lower genius, sometimes called the Agoeides, which mediates between the divine self of the neshama and the lower self, which is located in the ruach, primarily in Tifereth. This is also the seat of the personal ego, which interacts between the divine superconsciousness and the lower self, and constantly attempts to organize and interpret one's personal experience, both inner and outer experience. The persona, a conscious but artificial mask that we present to the outer world, is also to be found in the ruach. The nefesh, or lower side, resides in Yesod, comparable to Asagioli's lower unconscious. Taken seriously. A genuinely scientific attitude must be unprejudiced. The sole criterion for the validity of a hypothesis is whether or not it possesses an heuristic, i.e. explanatory value. The question now is, can we regard the possibilities set forth above as a valid hypothesis? There is no a priori reason why it should not be just as possible that the unconscious tendencies have a goal beyond the human person, so that the unconscious can do nothing but wish. Experience alone can decide which is the more suitable hypothesis. This new hypothesis was not entirely plausible to my very critical patient. The earlier view that I was the father-lover, and as such presented an ideal solution of the conflict, was incomparably more attractive to her way of feeling. Nevertheless, her intellect was sufficiently keen to appreciate the theoretical possibility of the new hypothesis. Meanwhile, the dreams continued to disintegrate the person of the doctor and swell him to ever vaster proportions. Concurrently with this, there now occurred something which at first I alone perceived with the utmost astonishment, namely a kind of subterranean undermining of the transference. Her relations with a certain friend deepened perceptibly, notwithstanding the fact that consciously she still clung to the transference, so that when the time came for leaving me, it was no catastrophe, but a perfectly reasonable parting. I had the privilege of being the only witness during the process of severance. I saw how the transpersonal control point developed. I cannot call it anything else. A guiding function, and step by step gathered to itself all the former personal over-evaluations. How, with this afflux of energy, it gained influence over the resisting, conscious mind without the patient's consciously noticing what was happening. From this, I realized that the dreams were not just fantasies, but self-representations of unconscious developments, which allowed the psyche of the patient gradually to grow out of the pointless personal tie. This change took place, as I showed, through the unconscious development of a transpersonal control point, a virtual goal, as it were, that expressed itself symbolically in a form which can only be described as a vision of God. The dreams swelled the human person of the doctor to the superhuman proportions, making him a gigantic primordial father, who is at the same time the wind, and in whose protecting arms the dreamer rests like an infant. If we try to make the patient's conscious and traditionally Christian idea of God responsible for the divine image in the dreams, we would still have to lay stress on the distortion. In religious matters, the patient had a critical and agnostic attitude, and her idea of a possible deity had long since passed into the realm of the inconceivable, i.e. had dwindled into a complete abstraction. In contrast to this, the God image of the dreams corresponded to the archaic conception of a nature demon, something like Wotan. God as spirit is here translated back into its original form, where there are Greek letters, means wind. God is the wind, stronger and mightier than man, an invisible breath spirit. As in Hebrew, ruah, so in Arabic, ruh, means breath and spirit. Out of the purely personal form, the dreams develop an archaic God image that is infinitely far from the conscious idea of God. It might be objected that this is simply an infantile image, a childhood memory. I would have no quarrel with this assumption if we were dealing with an old man sitting on a golden throne in heaven. But there is no trace of any sentimentality of that kind. Instead, we have a primordial idea that can correspond only to an archaic mentality. These primordial ideas, of which I have given a great many examples in my Symbols of Transformation, oblige one to make, in regard to unconscious material, a distinction of quite a different character from that between preconscious and unconscious, or subconscious and unconscious. The justification for these distinctions need not be discussed here. They have their specific view and are worth elaborating further as points of view. The fundamental distinction which experience has forced upon me claims to be no more than that. It should be evident from the foregoing that we have to distinguish in the unconscious a layer which we may call the personal unconscious. The materials contained in this layer are of a personal nature insofar as they have the character partly of acquisitions derived from the individual's life and partly of psychological factors which could just as well be conscious. It can readily be understood that incompatible psychological elements are liable to repression and therefore become unconscious. But on the other hand, this implies the possibility of making and keeping the repressed contents conscious once they have been recognized. We recognize them as personal contents because their effects or their partial manifestation or their source can be discovered in our personal past. They are the integral components of the personality. They belong to its inventory, and their loss to consciousness produces an inferiority in one respect or another. An inferiority, moreover, that has the psychological character, not so much of an organic lesion or an inborn defect, as of a lack which gives rise to a feeling of moral resentment. The sense of moral inferiority always indicates that the missing element is something which, to judge by this feeling about it, really ought not to be missing, or which could be made conscious if only one took sufficient trouble. The moral inferiority does not come from a collision with the generally accepted and, in a sense, arbitrary moral law, but from the conflict with one's own self, which, for reasons of psychic equilibrium, demands that the deficit be redressed. Whenever a sense of moral inferiority appears, it indicates not only a need to assimilate an unconscious component, but also the possibility of such assimilation. In the last resort, it is a man's moral qualities which force him, either through direct recognition of the need or indirectly through a painful neurosis, to assimilate his unconscious self and to keep himself fully conscious. Whoever progresses along this road of self-realization must inevitably bring into consciousness the contents of the personal unconscious, thus enlarging the scope of his personality. I should add at once that this enlargement has to do primarily with one's moral consciousness, one's knowledge of oneself, for the unconscious contents that are released and brought into consciousness by analysis are usually unpleasant, which is precisely why these wishes, memories, tendencies, plans, etc. are repressed. These are the contents which are brought to light in much the same way by a thorough confession, though to a much more limited extent. The rest comes out as a rule in dream analysis. It is often very interesting to watch how the dreams fetch up the essential points, bit by bit and with the nicest choice. The total material that is added to consciousness causes a considerable widening of the horizon, a deepened self-knowledge which, more than anything else, one would think, is calculated to humanize a man and make him modest. But even self-knowledge, assumed by all wise men to be the best and most efficacious, has different effects on different characters. We make very remarkable discoveries in this respect in practical analysis, but I shall deal with this question in the next chapter. As an example of the archaic idea of God shows, the unconscious seems to contain other things besides personal acquisitions and belongings. My patient was quite unconscious of the derivative of spirit from wind, or of the parallelism between the two. This content was not the product of her thinking, nor had she ever been taught it. The critical passage in the New Testament was inaccessible to her. And there's some Greek. Since she knew no Greek, if we must take it as a wholly personal acquisition, it might be a case of so-called cryptomnesia, the unconscious recollection of a thought which the dreamer had once read somewhere. I have nothing against such a possibility in this particular case, but I have seen a sufficient number of other cases, many of them are to be found in the book mentioned above, where cryptomnesia can be excluded with certainty. Even if it were a case of cryptomnesia, which seems to me very improbable, we should still have to explain what the predisposition was that caused just this image to be retained and later, as Simon puts it, ekphorated, in the Latin, effere, to produce. In any case, cryptomnesia or no cryptomnesia, we are dealing with a genuine and thoroughly primitive God image that grew up in the unconscious of a civilized person and produced a living effect, an effect which might well give the psychologist of religion food for reflection. There's nothing about this image that could be called personal. It is a wholly collective image, the ethnic origin of which has long been known to us. Here is an historical image of worldwide distribution that has come to existence, again through a natural psychic function. This is not so very surprising, since my patient was born into the world with a human brain, which presumably still functions today much as it did of old. We are dealing with a reactivated archetype, as I have elsewhere called these primordial images. These ancient images are restored to life by the primitive, analogical mode of thinking peculiar to dreams. It is not a question of inherited ideas, but of inherited thought patterns. In view of these facts, we must assume that the unconscious contains not only personal, but also impersonal, collective components in the form of inherited categories or archetypes. I have therefore advanced the hypothesis that at its deeper levels, the unconscious possesses collective contents in a relatively active state. This is why I speak of a collective unconscious. 2. Phenomena resulting from the assimilation of the unconscious. The process of assimilating the unconscious leads to some very remarkable phenomena. It produces in some patients an unmistakable, often unpleasant increase of self-confidence and conceit. They are full of themselves. They know everything. They imagine themselves to be fully informed of everything concerning their unconscious, and are persuaded that they understand perfectly everything that comes out of it. At every interview with the doctor, they get more and more above themselves. Others, on the contrary, feel themselves more and more crushed under the contents of the unconscious. They lose their self-confidence and abandon themselves with dull resignation to all the extraordinary things that the unconscious produces. The former, overflowing with feelings of their own importance, assume a responsibility for the unconscious that goes much too far, beyond all reasonable bounds, and the others finally give up all sense of responsibility, overcome by a sense of the powerlessness of the ego against the fate working through the unconscious. If we analyze these two modes of reaction more deeply, we find that the optimistic self-confidence of the first conceals a profound sense of impotence, for which their conscious optimism acts as an unsuccessful compensation, while the pessimistic resignation of the others masks a defiant will to power, far surpassing in cocksureness and the conscious optimism of the first type. With these two modes of reaction, I have sketched only two crude extremes. A finer shading would have been truer to reality. As I have said elsewhere, every analysand starts by unconsciously misusing his newly won knowledge in the interests of his abnormal neurotic attitude, unless he is sufficiently freed from his symptoms in the early stages to be able to dispense with further treatment altogether. A very important contributory factor is that in the early stages, everything is still understood on the objective level, i.e., without distinction between imago and object, so that everything is referred directly to the object. Hence, the man for whom other people are the objects of prime importance will conclude from any self-knowledge he may have imbibed at this stage of the analysis. Aha, so that is what other people are like. He will therefore feel it his duty, according to his nature, tolerant or otherwise, to enlighten the world. But the other man, who feels himself to be more the object of his fellows than their subject, will be weighed down by this self-knowledge, and become correspondingly depressed. I am naturally leaving out of account these numerous and more superficial natures, who experience these problems only by the way. In both cases, the relation to the object is reinforced. In the first case, in an active, in the second case, in a reactive state. The collective element is markedly accentuated. The one extends the sphere of his action, the other the sphere of his suffering. Adler has employed the term godlikeness to characterize certain basic features of neurotic power psychology. If I likewise borrow the same term from Faust, I use it here more in the sense of that well-known passage where Mephisto writes, Eritis sicut Deus, scientes bonum et malum, in the Student's Album, and makes the following aside. Just follow the old advice, and my cousin the snake. There'll come a time when your godlikeness will make you quiver and quake. The godlikeness evidently refers to knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. The analysis and conscious realization of unconscious contents engender a certain superior tolerance, thanks to which even relatively indigestible portions of one's unconscious characterology can be accepted. This tolerance may look very wise and superior, but often it is no more than a grand gesture that brings all sorts of consequences in its train. Two spheres have been brought together, which before were kept anxiously apart. After considerable resistances have been overcome, the union of opposites is successfully achieved, at least to all appearances. The deeper understanding thus gained, the juxtaposition of what was before separated, and hence the apparent overcoming of the moral conflict, give rise to a feeling of superiority that may well be expressed by the term godlikeness. But the same juxtaposition of good and evil can have a very different effect on a different kind of temperament. Not everyone will feel himself a Superman, holding in his hands the scales of good and evil. It may also seem as though he were a helpless object caught between hammer and anvil, not in the least a Hercules at the parting of the ways, but rather a rudderless ship buffeted between Scylla and Charybdis. For without knowing it, he is caught up in perhaps the greatest and most ancient of human conflicts, experiencing the throes of eternal principles in collision. Well might he feel himself like a Prometheus, chained to the Caucasus, or as one crucified. This would be a godlikeness in suffering. Godlikeness is certainly not a scientific concept, although it aptly characterizes the psychological state in question. Nor do I imagine that every reader will immediately grasp the peculiar state of mind implied by godlikeness. The term belongs exclusively to the sphere of belles lettres, so I should probably be better advised to give a more circumspect description of this state. The insight and understanding, then, gained by the analysand, usually reveal much to him that was before unconscious. He naturally applies this knowledge to his environment. In consequences, he sees, or thinks he sees, many things that before were invisible. Since his knowledge was helpful to him, he readily assumes that it would be useful also to others. In this way, he is liable to become arrogant. It may be well meant, but it is nonetheless annoying to other people. He feels as though he possesses a key that opens many, perhaps even all, doors. Psychoanalysis itself has the same bland unconsciousness of its limitations, as can clearly be seen from the way it meddles with works of art. Since human nature is not compounded wholly of light, but also abounds in shadows, the insight gained in practical analysis is often somewhat painful, the more so if, as is generally the case, one has previously neglected the other side. Hence there are people who take their newly won insight very much to heart, far too much in fact, quite forgetting that they are not unique in having a shadow side. They allow themselves to get unduly depressed and are then inclined to doubt everything, finding nothing right anywhere. This is why many excellent analysts with very good ideas can never bring themselves to publish them, because the psychic problem, as they see it, is so overwhelmingly vast that it seems to them almost impossible to tackle it scientifically. One man's optimism makes him overweening, while another's pessimism makes him over-anxious and despondent. Such are the forms which the great conflict takes when reduced to a smaller scale. But even in these less proportions, the essence of the conflict is easily recognized. The arrogance of the one and the despondency of the other share a common uncertainty as to their boundaries. The one is excessively expanded, the other excessively contracted. Their individual boundaries are in some way obliterated. If we now consider the fact that, as a result of psychic compensation, great humility stands very close to pride, and that pride goeth before a fall, we can easily discover behind the haughtiness certain traits of an anxious sense of inferiority. In fact, we see clearly how his uncertainty forces the enthusiast to puff up his truths, of which he feels none too sure, and to win proselytizes to his side in order that his followers may prove to himself the value and trustworthiness of his own convictions. Nor is he altogether so happy in his fund of knowledge as to be able to hold it out alone. At bottom, he feels isolated by it, and the secret fear of being left alone with it induces him to trot out his opinions and interpretations in and out of season, because only when convincing someone else does he feel safe from gnawing doubts. It is just the reverse with our despondent friend. The more he withdraws and hides himself, the greater becomes his secret need to be understood and recognized. Although he speaks of his inferiority, he does not really believe it. There arises with him a defiant conviction of his unrecognized merits, and in consequence he is sensitive to the slightest disapprobation, always wearing the stricken air of one who is misunderstood and deprived of his rightful due. In this way he nurses a morbid pride and an insolent discontent, which is the very last thing he wants and for which his environment has to pay all the more dearly. Both are at once too small and too big, Their individual mean, never very secure, now becomes shakier than ever. It sounds almost grotesque to describe such a state as godlike. But since each in his way steps beyond his human proportions, both of them are a little superhuman, and therefore, figuratively speaking, godlike. If we wish to avoid the use of this metaphor, I would suggest that we speak instead of psychic inflation. The term seems to me appropriate insofar as the state we are discussing involves an extension of the personality beyond individual limits. In other words, a state of being puffed up. In such a state, a man fills a space which normally he cannot fill. He can only fill it by appropriating to himself contents and qualities which properly exist for themselves, alone, and should therefore remain outside our bounds. What lies outside ourselves belongs either to someone else, or to everyone, or to no one. Since psychic inflation is by no means a phenomenon induced exclusively by analysis, but occurs just as often in ordinary life, we can investigate it equally well in other cases. A very common instance is the humorless way in which many men identify themselves with their business or their titles. The office I hold is certainly my special activity, but it is also a collective factor that has come into existence historically through the cooperation of many people and whose dignity rests solely on collective approval. When, therefore, I identify myself with my office or title, I behave as though I myself were the whole complex of social factors of which that office consists, or as though I were not only the bearer of the office, but also, and at the same time, the approval of society. I have made an extraordinary extension of myself, and have usurped qualities which are not in me, but outside me. L'état, c'est est moi, is the motto for such people. In the case of inflation, through knowledge, we are dealing with something similar in principle, though psychologically more subtle. Hence, it is not the dignity of an office that causes the inflation, but very significant fantasies. I will explain what I mean by practical example, choosing a mental case whom I happened to know personally, and who is also mentioned in a publication by Mader. The case is characterized by a high degree of inflation. In mental cases, we can observe all the phenomena that are present only fleetingly in normal people, in a cruder and enlarged form. The patient suffered from a paranoid dementia with megalomania. He was in telephonic communication with the Mother of God and other great ones. In human reality, he was a wretched locksmith's apprentice who at the age of 19 had become incurably insane. He had never been blessed with intelligence, but he had, among other things, hit upon the magnificent idea that the world was his picture book, the pages of which he could turn at will. The proof was quite simple. He had only to turn around, and there was a new page for him to see. This is Schopenhauer's world as will and idea, in unadorned, primitive concreteness of vision. A shattering idea indeed, born of extreme alienation and seclusion from the world, but so naively and simply expressed that at first one can only smile at the grotesqueness of it. And yet, this primitive way of looking lies at the very heart of Schopenhauer's brilliant vision of the world. Only a genius or a madman could so disentangle himself from the bonds of reality as to see the world as his picture book. Did the patient actually work out or build up such a vision, or did it just befall him? Or did he perhaps fall into it? His pathological disintegration and inflation points rather to the latter. It is no longer he that thinks and speaks, but it thinks and speaks within him. He hears voices. So the difference between him and Schopenhauer is that in him, the vision remained at the stage of a mere spontaneous growth, while Schopenhauer abstracted it and expressed it in a language of universal validity. In doing so, he raised it out of its subterranean beginnings into the clear light of collective consciousness. But it would be quite wrong to suppose that the patient's vision had a purely personal character or value, as though it were something that belonged to him. If that were so, he would be a philosopher. A man is a philosopher of genius only when he succeeds in transmuting the primitive and merely natural vision into an abstract idea belonging to the common stock of consciousness. This achievement, and this alone, constitutes his personal value, for which he may take credit without necessarily succumbing to inflation. But the sick man's vision is an impersonal value, a natural growth against which he is powerless to defend himself, by which he is actually swallowed up and wafted clean out of the world. Far from his mastering the idea and expanding it into a philosophical view of the world, it is truer to say that the undoubted grandeur of his vision blew him up to pathological proportions. The personal value lies entirely in the philosophical achievement, not in the primary vision. To the philosopher as well, this vision comes as so much increment, and is simply a part of the common property of mankind, in which, in principle, everyone has a share. The golden apple dropped from the same tree, whether they be gathered by an imbecile locksmith's apprentice or by Schopenhauer. There is, however, yet another thing to be learnt from this example, namely that these transpersonal contents are not just inert or dead matter that can be annexed at will. Rather, they are living entities which exert an attractive force upon the conscious mind. Identification with one's office or one's title is very attractive indeed, which is precisely why so many men are nothing more than the decorum accorded to them by society. In vain, one would look for a personality behind the husk. Underneath all the padding, one would find a very pitiable little creature. That is why the office, whatever this outer husk may be, is so attractive. It offers easy compensation for personal deficiencies. Outer attractions, such as offices, titles, and other social regalia, are not the only things that cause inflation. These are simply impersonal quantities that lie outside in society, in the collective consciousness. But just as there is a society outside the individual, So there is a collective psyche outside the personal psyche, namely the collective unconscious, concealing, as the above example shows, elements that are no whit less attractive. And there, just as a man may suddenly step into the world on his professional dignity, Messieurs, à présent, c'est jour, roi, so another may disappear out of it equally suddenly when it is his lot to behold of these mighty images that put a new face upon the world. There are the magical representations collectives, which underlie the slogan, the catchword, and, on a higher level, the language of the poet and mystic. I am reminded of another mental case, who was neither a poet nor anything very outstanding, just a naturally quiet and rather sentimental youth. He had fallen in love with a girl, and as so often happens, had failed to ascertain whether his love was requited. His primitive participation mystique took it for granted that his agitations were plainly the agitations of the other, which on the lower levels of human psychology is naturally very often the case. Thus he built up a sentimental love fantasy, which precipitately collapsed when he discovered that the girl would have none of him. He was so desperate that he went straight to the river to drown himself. It was late at night, and the stars gleamed up at him from the dark water. It seemed to him that the stars were swimming 2 by 2 down the river, and a wonderful feeling came over him. He forgot his suicidal intentions, and gazed fascinated at the strange, sweet drama. And gradually he became aware that every star was a face, and all these pairs were lovers, who were carried along, locked in a dreaming embrace. An entirely new understanding came to him. All had changed. His fate, his disappointment, even his love, receded and fell away. The memory of the girl grew distant, blurred, but instead he felt with complete certainty that untold riches were promised to him. He knew that an immense treasure lay hidden for him in the neighboring observatory. The result was that he was arrested by the police at 4 o'clock in the morning, attempting to break into the observatory. What had happened? His poor head glimpsed a Dantesque vision, whose loveliness he could never have grasped had he read it in a poem. But he saw it, and it had transformed him. What had hurt him most was now far away, a new and undreamed of world of stars, tracing their silent courses far beyond this grievous earth, had opened out to him the moment he crossed Proserpine's threshold. The intuition of untold wealth, and could any fail to be touched by this thought, came to him like a revelation. For his poor turnip head, it was too much. He did not drown in the river, but in an eternal image, and its beauty perished with him. Just as one man may disappear in his social role, so another may be engulfed in an inner vision and be lost to his surroundings. Many fathomless transformations of personality, like sudden conversions and other far-reaching changes of mind, originate in the attractive power of a collective image, which, as the present example shows, can cause such a high degree of inflation that the entire personality is disintegrated. This disintegration is a mental disease of a transitory or permanent nature, a splitting of the mind or schizophrenia, in Bleuler's term. The pathological inflation naturally depends on some innate weakness of the personality against the autonomy of collective unconscious contents. We should probably get nearest to the truth if we think of the conscious and personal psyche as resting upon the broad basis of an inherited and universal psychic disposition, which is as such unconscious, and that our personal psyche bears the same relation to the collective psyche as the individual to society. But equally, just as the individual is not merely a unique and separate being, but is also a social being, so the human psyche is not a self-contained and wholly individual phenomenon, but also a collective one. And just as certain social functions or instincts are opposed to the interests of single individuals, so the human psyche exhibits certain functions or tendencies which, on account of their collective nature, are opposed to individual needs. The reason for this is that every man is born with a highly differentiated brain and is thus assured of a wide range of mental functioning, which is neither developed ontogenetically nor acquired, but to the degree that human brains are uniformly differentiated, the mental functioning thereby made possible is also collective and universal. This explains, for example, the interesting fact that the unconscious processes of the most widely separated peoples and races shows a quite remarkable correspondence, which displays itself, among other things, in the extraordinary but well-authenticated analogies between the forms and motifs of autochthonous myths. The universal similarity of human brains leads to the universal possibility of a uniform mental functioning. This functioning is the collective psyche. Insomuch as there are differentiations corresponding to race, tribe, and even family, there is also a collective psyche limited to race, tribe, and family, over and above the universal collective psyche. To borrow an expression from Pierre Janet, the collective psyche comprises the parties inferiores of the psychic functions. That is to say, these deep-rooted, well-nigh automatic portions of the individual psyche which are inherited and are to be found everywhere, and are thus impersonal or supra-personal. Consciousness plus the personal unconscious constitutes the parties superiores of the psychic functions. These portions, therefore, are developed ontogenetically and acquired. Consequently, the individual who annexes the unconscious heritage of the collective psyche to what has accrued to him in the course of his ontogenetic development, as though it were part of the latter, enlarges the scope of his personality in an illegitimate way, and suffers the consequences. Insofar as the collective psyche comprises the parties inferiores of the psychic functions, and thus forms the basis of every personality, it has the effect of crushing and devaluing the personality. This shows itself either in the aforementioned stifling of self-confidence, or else in an unconscious heightening of the ego's importance to the power of a pathological will to power. By raising the point, or the personal unconscious to consciousness, the analysis makes the subject aware of things which he is generally aware of in others, but never in himself. This discovery makes him therefore less individually unique and more collective. His collectivization is not always a step to the bad. It may sometimes be a step to the good. There are people who repress their good qualities and consciously give free rein to their infantile desires. The lifting of personal repressions at first brings purely personal contents into consciousness, but attached to them are the collective elements of the unconscious, the ever-present instincts, qualities, and ideas, images, as well as all those statistical quotas of average virtue and average vice, which we recognize when we say, everyone has in him something of the criminal, the genius, and the saint. Thus, a living picture emerges, containing pretty well everything that moves upon.
And I'll share words to the wise guys. If you're, you gotta keep watering the garden. You gotta keep watering the plant. The plant needs attention every day, or if not every day, every other day. You can't blow people off and then come back a week later and say, "Hey, how you doing?"
I think those people are being as elusive as you are, though, Randy.
No,
It's like, don't forget that everybody's playing the same game.
I think that some people are not. Some people.
Randy, you've got enough recorded history of your voice and your mannerisms and your personality on Clubhouse. You just need to download all that, train an AI agent on it, and then have your AI personality talk to all these women for you. And tell it to be you can even turn up the swab a little bit,
Someday, but not yet. No. You know what? That would probably work for most people, but my personality is so very unique that I don't believe AI could really replicate it. But anyway, I'm just, the question is, how long? Oh, Norm left too. Great. Oh boy, I am a real fucking winner, huh? Whoever I'm talking to just.
They're all gone right at the end. They just abandoned us.
I don't know. It's okay. All right, guys. I came in to say hello, talk to my friends. Apparently I started talking and they all left. You guys in the audience, you're my real friends. You didn't leave when I started talking.
Checkerboard of the world,
So
the
you
good
guys
and the
in
bad, the
audience,
fair and the
Shane,
foul.
Boomaloo,
A sense of solidarity with the world is gradually built up, which is felt by many natures as something very positive and in certain cases actually is the deciding factor in the treatment of neurosis. I have myself seen cases who, in this condition, managed for the first time in their lives to arouse love and even to experience it themselves, or by daring to leap into the unknown, they get involved in the very fate for which they were suited. I've seen not a few who, taking this condition as final, remained for years in a state of enterprising euphoria. I have often heard such cases referred to as shining examples of analytical therapy, but I must point out that cases of this euphoric and enterprising type are so utterly lacking in differentiation from the world that nobody could pass them as fundamentally cured. To my way of thinking, there are as much cured as not cured. I have had occasion to follow up the lives of such patients, and it must be owned that many of them showed symptoms of maladjustment, which, if persisted in, gradually leads to the sterility and monotony so characteristic of those who have divested themselves of their egos. Here too I am speaking of the borderline cases, and not of the less valuable, normal, average folk for whom the question of adaptation is more technical than problematic. If I were more of a therapist than an investigator, I would naturally be unable to check a certain optimism of judgment, because my eyes would then get glued to the number of cures. But my conscience, as an investigator, is concerned not with quantity, but with quality. Nature is aristocratic, and one person of value outweighs 10 lesser ones. My eye followed the valuable people, and from them I learned the dubiousness of the results of a purely personal analysis, and also to understand the reasons for this dubiousness. If, Through assimilation of the unconscious, we make the mistake of including the collective psyche in the inventory of personal psychic functions. A dissolution of the personality into its paired opposites inevitably follows. Besides the pair of opposites already discussed, megalomania and the sense of inferiority, which are so painfully evident in neurosis, there are many others from which I will single out only the specifically moral pair of opposites, namely good and evil. The specific virtues and vices of humanity are contained in the collective psyche, like everything else. One man arrogates collective virtue to himself as his personal merit, another takes collective vice as his personal guilt. Both are as illusory as the megalomania and the inferiority, because the imagery, virtues, and the imagery, wickedness, are simply the moral pair of opposites contained in the collective psyche, which have become perceptible or have been rendered conscious artificially. How much these paired opposites are contained in the collective psyche is exemplified by primitives. One observer will extol the greatest virtues in them, while another will record the very worst impressions of the self-same tribe. For the primitive, whose personal differentiation is, as we know, only just beginning, both judgments are true, because his psyche is essentially collective, and therefore, for the most part, unconscious. He is still more or less identical with the collective psyche, and for that reason shares equally in the collective virtues and vices, without any personal attribution and without inner contradiction. The contradiction arises only when the personal development of the psyche begins.